Bipolar enlightenment. Bipolar enlightenment. Could it be that these two experiences, which seem so different from each other, could actually be on a sensory level the same thing? At first you may think this is impossible, but when you take a closer look, both experiences start with the same event, a collapse of the ego. Now, most people already know that bipolar disorder can have some pretty negative symptoms, like spending lots of money, having big mood swings, or even hallucinations and paranoia, which I talk about at length in other videos. But few people are aware that a bipolar manic episode can also include many symptoms that have been associated throughout history with glimpses of spiritual enlightenment. So, whether you're a Buddhist monk who gets there by meditating for 20 years, or you're a 19-year-old kid who gets hit by it in a shopping mall, both experiences will most likely involve aspects which are deeply spiritual in nature. And when I say spiritual, what I really mean is mystical. So now I'm going to take you through a series of sensory experiences which are common to both the person going through an experience of enlightenment and the person going through the type of acute psychosis which is commonly associated with bipolar 1. And to illustrate my point, I'll be using the work of my favorite artist, Salvador Dali, who I'm sure you would agree, if he were alive today, would be heavily medicated. The first thing that often happens in a bipolar manic crisis, and is also known to happen in different forms of enlightenment, such as a Kundalini awakening, is that you have this incredible surge of high energy. That's usually the first thing that hits you. As I described in detail in the first video of this series, the cause of this surge in energy is that there's an ego collapse and the soul is set free for the first time. Speaking personally, the deepest mystic experience that I had was the sense of oneness with everything. You lose the feeling of separation between your body and everything else, so that you feel that you are everything and everything is you. You feel as if you've accessed a deeper level of reality, and with that there is a deeper level of understanding regarding who we are and what we're doing here on earth. The experience is indescribable in terms of communicating in normal language, and as a result, the person in the experience may try and express themselves by using metaphors. A person's senses may also be heightened with improved vision, taste, smell, and hearing. They also have a heightened sensitivity towards other people. You can feel other people's vibe or read their thoughts in a way that you never could before. For many people, there's a sense of timelessness, with some people having the sensation that they can control time, stopping or starting time based on their own individual desire or concentration. There will often be an overwhelming sense of love coming out of you, with an affection for other people and an appreciation for beauty, so that you may find yourself having expressions of love for even plants or animals. There is a release of many repressions in these experiences, and one of the biggest is the release of the shame we have of our own bodies. This is why it's so common for people to strip naked during psychosis. And with all of this happening, there's just an overwhelming feeling of sacredness to everything, as if you're in the most magnificent church or temple in the world. Everything around you seems to be touched by God. As Dr. John Weir Perry describes in the book The Far Side of Madness, you may feel that you're in a type of middle world, not quite heaven, not quite earth, a sort of purgatory or bardo in which all of these experiences are happening. And very often in this middle world, you'll feel that you're being tested by God in some way, and that maybe even people are coming to you not as they appear, as in their earthly name, but as some sort of characters that are there to test you. And a big part of this test will involve a confrontation with death. Most people feel that they are somehow encountering their own death or think that they have died in this process. As part of the healing which takes place, there is often a regression into the origins of your own life. Many people find themselves returning to their early childhood or even into the womb of their mother. Others have the sensation of returning to the beginning of the cosmos, the Big Bang in a sense. And for some, it's a combination of both, as well as other powerful experiences, such as recalling a past life. And as your process starts to move through, you begin to have a shift in your values. Your own feelings and sense of personal integrity become more important to you than they ever were before. There's also a broadening of your consciousness, an elevation to a more social, global consciousness. So that global issues such as the environment or poverty, which maybe were in the back of your mind before, now are right in front of you as a pressing issue. So, like I was saying in the beginning, if you're a 19-year-old kid who's been hit by a bipolar manic crisis, you should easily be able to recognize some, if not all, of these sensory experiences that I'm talking about. But what you didn't know is that throughout history, all of these sensory experiences that you have somehow been related to different forms of enlightenment. These mystical sensory experiences have been associated with Satori in Zen, Samadhi in Hinduism, Nirvana from Buddhism, and even the visions which Christian saints would have. And in the West, these experiences have been recognized by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists as well, leading-edge people such as Dr. Stan Grof, who refer to these experiences as being part of a spiritual emergency. Ken Wilber refers to a variety of mystic experiences, and I think all of these would be related to what he calls nature mysticism. And Abraham Maslow, who is most famous for the Maslow hierarchy of needs, referred to what I describe here as part of a peak experience. So there's clearly a history of understanding these experiences on a psychological level in the West. However, what is enlightenment or a mystic experience in the mainstream today? Well, according to science, psychiatry, and our supposedly modern society, enlightenment is insanity. It's a bipolar manic crisis, an acute psychosis. It doesn't exist. It's a complete breakdown of our rational thought caused by brain damage or a chemical imbalance. It has no value to your life whatsoever, and it's to be stopped with medications at all costs. Now what I want to do in part 2 of this video is show you some examples of how each of these spiritual experiences can lead to some very strange behavior on your part. Behavior which everyone around you will mistakenly see as signs of mental illness. So that's up next. Starting in April 2007, I began an investigation into the difference between the beneficial psychotic episode that I had 12 years ago, which I came to understand as a spiritual emergency, and this thing called bipolar disorder, or more specifically bipolar mania, which some people in my family had been diagnosed with a year ago. As many of you know, during this year of research, I've made many YouTube videos, and through YouTube, I've been in close contact with over 150 bipolar people who have been gracious enough to share their stories with me. I've received thousands of YouTube comments that I've also learned from. I've read about 15 new books in that time and looked at hundreds of websites and videos, both for psychiatry and against psychiatry. And together with my wife, we've worked with 4 people this year through 6 manic episodes of acute psychosis, basically periods of insanity like I went through 12 years earlier. And the big thing I've learned this year is that while there's no guarantees, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be healed. And if you don't believe me, I highly suggest that you take a look at the work of some pioneering psychiatrists from the 1970s who were healing schizophrenics in a way completely different than the typical hospitalization environment that we all know today. The late Dr. John Weir Perry documents very high levels of success rates with schizophrenics at his clinic Diabasis in his book Trials of a Visionary Mind. Dr. Loren Mosher also set up a similar project called Soteria in San Francisco while he was the chief of the Schizophrenia Center at the National Institute of Mental Health. The book Soteria is a great look at what happened in that house for over a 12-year period. And I also have a film of Soteria in my YouTube favorites that's very interesting for you to take a look at. Dr. Stan Grof has made a career of healing people from various mental illnesses, many of the stories of which he shares in his new book, When the Impossible Happens, which really challenges mainstream psychiatry. Perhaps the most interesting story is of Dr. David Lukoff, who in 1972 thought he was Buddha and Christ and was here on a messianic journey to save the world. Dr. David Lukoff is the one that fought to get the term spiritual emergency recognized in the DSM-IV. Now here's the shocker. The reason that these doctors can heal people in acute psychosis like bipolar mania, schizophrenia, spiritual emergencies is that they recognize that acute psychosis in itself is intended to be a healing process. It's not a mental illness at all. It is a healing process. You see, what happens in an acute psychosis is not that you've lost your mind, but rather that you've been plunged into the subconscious of your mind. Now, the problem with our society today, be it the doctors or our parents, is that we don't give value to this experience, and in fact, we think that the non-ordinary states of consciousness that you go into during a psychotic period have no value whatsoever. In fact, we're terrified of them as a society, and as a result, we don't want you to go there. You are not allowed to have this experience. So what happens is the doctors and the family, they form a rescue mission to get you out of that water. And as we all know, part of that rescue mission now means hospitalizing you, medicating you, telling you that you're mentally ill and that you have a permanent condition like asthma or diabetes that you will need medication for your entire life. And unfortunately, as things are today, this is what's happening, because once they tell you these things and they get you medicated and hospitalized in this way and tell you that this experience is to be feared and avoided, well, it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and you never heal properly the way you're supposed to. And that's why bipolar people, as soon as they go off their medications, it doesn't take them very long usually before they go into a relapse, because this is a healing process, much like if you were vomiting. You've got some sickness inside of you and it needs to come out. And as soon as those medications stop, the vomiting starts again. It's a healing process. You're supposed to go into psychosis. And once you're there, once you're in that non-ordinary state of consciousness, instead of fighting against this process, what you really need to do is surrender and just let go. And during this acute psychosis, what I've especially learned working with people this year is that, unlike my own situation where I was able to fight off negative forces and sort of respect my experience, most people, bipolar people, especially if you're younger, are absolutely going to need support and help to get through this process. And where people especially need the help and support isn't so much when they're in that sort of high state where everything's sort of dreamy and sparkly and wonderful, but during periods where trauma is released, because the secret to this acute psychosis is it is releasing you from trauma that you've held in your body for your entire life. And the trauma that is released can come in a variety of forms. In my case, I had a scuba diving accident a few months before my manic episode, and that experience really came back to me and started my episode. So physical problems and physical accidents can be part of the trauma that's released. The most common one to psychology is like things like the relationship you have with your parents. And I would say almost everybody I talked to, maybe everybody, had an issue with one of their parents, where the parent tends to be a kind of a hard person that insists that the child live according to their rules and according to their ways. Most of the bipolar people I know have had an issue with a particular hard parent. And in the case of, especially with schizophrenia, this parenting trouble can be deeper. It can be related to physical abuse, and for many schizophrenics, sexual abuse is a huge part of the trauma they're dealing with in their daily life. And we're just covering it up and covering it over by telling them that they've got a chemical imbalance. So instead of dealing with bipolar mania like this, we've got to start dealing with it more like this. And I intentionally picked out this picture because it shows a compassionate love between two men, which would normally be taken as a homosexual relationship. But I'm telling you that when you're dealing with a person in acute psychosis, you've got to be available to give them unconditional love regardless of their sex. You've got to be able to bond with them on a very intimate level. And the reason is that when people are in a manic state, they are so much more sensitive than you could ever imagine. And as soon as you're in front of them, they can tell whether you are coming to them with love or you're coming to them with fear. And as it's dealt with now, everybody is coming at them with fear. So again, these people need to be approached with a loving intention. Their inner experience needs to be respected and validated as a sacred thing, a sacred healing process that they need to go through. And with your support, the person can now engage this inner process, and they really need that support because it can be scary for them. Like I said, it can really feel like a life and death situation. Now, typically, an acute psychosis is going to last maybe between 2 and 6 days. That's like when they're really out there and can be really insane, and they really require 2 people with them 24 hours a day during this period. And depending on the depth of the trauma that we're dealing with, it could take a few psychoses for this to actually finish. So in the example of my niece, she needed 3 manic episodes before she finally finished her process, and that took over a period of 2 months. So, is this process long and difficult? Sometimes, yes. It can be very difficult, especially to be a support person for these people. You need a lot of patience, you need a lot of compassion, and you need a lot of courage. However, even though this process can be very difficult for people for a few months, the benefit you get on the other end can be a total rebirth of this person. Not only do they go back to normal, but they come back healed. They go on to live a much more vital, much more alive life, and they can grow. And when you compare that to the long-term life of medication, thinking of yourself as mentally ill forever, I mean, there's just no comparison. So, in conclusion, obviously, this video is just the tip of the iceberg regarding what is a radically different approach to your bipolar disorder. And if you are bipolar out there, I highly recommend you subscribe, because for the rest of 2008, I'm going to be putting up one video after another that's going to help you look at your bipolar disorder in a whole new way. In my last video, I talked about how, in order to heal bipolar disorder, the battle between the soul and the ego needed to come to its proper end. And the first thing we need to do is provide supportive environments so that when people go into psychosis, we allow them to embrace and engage their experience instead of blocking it fearfully. And one of the things that happens when we allow the psychosis to process is that we go through a period of purification of the soul. And during this period, we have the opportunity to rid ourselves of much of the emotional pain that we carry with us in our daily lives. So in this video, I want to provide a type of inventory of all of the different experiences that can happen to you within psychosis that allow this soul purification to take place. Before I begin, I think it's interesting to mention that all the experiences I'm going to talk about can also happen during periods of meditation, during mystic states, and they can also be induced by taking psychedelic drugs. And the reason for that is that certain meditations, mystic practices, and drugs can lead to a collapse of the ego, which I've already explained in my video, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder. Very often, one of the first things to happen when people enter into a psychosis is that they have a release of their biological repressions. And with that, sexual repression is usually at the top of the list. Each one of us carries some level of sexual repression with us. If we didn't, we'd all be in jail. So with our inhibitions out of the way, we may find ourselves excessively sexual or flirtatious with people. We may be what is considered to be inappropriately affectionate with people, maybe people we don't even know. Or in deep psychosis, we may even start spontaneously masturbating. We may also recognize that at almost every moment of the day we're holding in our bladders or our intestines, and we may decide to just let all that go, pissing or shitting anytime, anywhere. Another thing that can happen, especially because your senses have come alive, is that we may have a particular fascination with these materials as well. Even in my own situation, I felt the need to pee on the carpet of a hotel ballroom and then lay right down in the urine afterwards. And probably one of the most common symptoms of manic episodes is our loss of shame. We just immediately feel the desire to get naked and do everything we can without our clothes on. Now, mania is a state that is famous for being quite high and sometimes extremely positive, and in other videos I've made, I've talked about the spiritual potential of these states, and in fact that they can be quite sacred experiences. But what happens usually is as the mania continues and you get through the oneness and connection to everything, what usually follows are regressions into experiences in your life which were emotionally painful for you, things that you probably still haven't gotten over yet, at least on an emotional level. And as a support person, being there next to somebody who is re-experiencing a trauma from their life can be very strange. Because while some people in psychosis may simply remember the experiences, others relive it. And so what will happen is when the person regresses into a painful trauma from their childhood, when you look at their face, you will see child's eyes and they may talk to you in the child's voice. And this occurs because the consciousness of the person is in another time and in another place. Now, it should be no surprise that many of these traumatic experiences revolve around physical abuse, verbal abuse, and sex abuse, especially among the most acute cases. And back in the 1960s, Dr. R.D. Laing was really the first psychiatrist to highlight the role of the dysfunctional family among people with mental disorders. In fact, one study I've come across recently showed that people suffering from schizophrenia were more than twice as likely to have divorced parents. So while trauma experienced in childhood plays a critical role in many mental disorders, trauma during adulthood can also play a role as well. And I'm not only talking about emotional issues, but physical accidents can also be a big part of the trauma which we need to heal. Death of a parent, child, or spouse is also enough to trigger a manic episode, especially among women. But in truth, the traumas which can heal during psychosis really come from any repressed memory or emotion that was too painful for us to deal with at the time that it happened. The fact that life traumas play a huge role in mental disorders should hardly be surprising. However, what will be surprising is that many people regress into the trauma they experienced at the time of their birth. In The Holotropic Mind, Stan Grof discusses in detail the different stages of our birth process and how the traumas from each stage of birth can have implications for the rest of our lives. For example, in his clinical experience, Grof has found that there is a very strong connection between the sensation of having your life being controlled by other people and being a cesarean baby. Other birth traumas which can be relived during psychosis are the use of forceps on your skull when you were a baby, the sensation that you were an unwanted pregnancy by your mother, the various sensations and emotions connected to a long and difficult delivery, like the feeling that you're being strangled or suffocated. These can be experienced as well. And even the use of alcohol, drugs, or smoking during pregnancy is something that you may regress into in order to heal. Now, the next set of regressions I'm going to talk about completely defy the mechanics of mainstream science and are completely rejected by psychiatry and mainstream psychology today. According to Grof, Perry, and many of the people who write me on my YouTube channel, there is a return to biological and organic origins that many people seem to go through as well, myself included. It's not uncommon for people to feel strong connections with their ancestors or other tribal peoples as they regress. They may have the sensation that they've experienced a past life or that they lived in another time or another place. It's very common for people to take on lower life forms, particularly animal personalities, especially apes. And in one particular case, a guy wrote me and he just told me he had the need to go down in his basement and just move around like a lizard. There can also be the sensation of having strong connections with plants or even all of life in all of creation. And along with the more earthly or planetary regressions to our origins, we also have regressions to our cosmic origins as well. People have the sensation that they've gone back to the beginning of time and space with the Big Bang. Or like I did, that they're somehow traveling through the cosmos. Other people just have this grander connection of cosmic consciousness. And then on the other end, we have people who seem to have the sensation that they're being encountered or even possessed by aliens, which isn't always a pleasant experience. Perhaps the most spiritual aspect of an acute psychosis is the actual encounter of spirits themselves. Many people have the apparent hallucination of seeing angels or seeing devils or demons of some kind. Other people feel that the spirits are near them, and often they have some sort of message for the person related to their life purpose or a vision of some type. Others feel that they're actually channeling spirits when they're in a state. And then finally, and we've seen this a few times, people have the feeling, particularly that the devil is inside them and trying to get out. To the outsider, watching someone in psychosis working with a support person, it could seem like the whole process is a whole lot more like an exorcism than it is like therapy. Now, along with releasing the repressions and traumas that we've already talked about, there's also the release of the physical energy that's associated with these traumas. And these energies are released by simply allowing the person in psychosis to do what they intuitively want to do, provided that they're not hurting themselves or other people. And as most episodes start with people in a high energy level, they may want to do some physical exercise or get them running, something like that. But then there's other deeper energies, things like physical tremors or vibrations that are just happening within the body itself. And these tremors and vibrations can be accompanied by cathartic screaming or singing or even vocalizing of particular sounds that for some reason you just feel motivated to make. You just want to make that noise. Even vomiting can occasionally occur as the person releases the biochemicals that are associated with their traumas. When a person has like a volcanic eruption of physical energy coming out of them, sometimes afterwards there's like a blackout period where they just go away. And whereas in that situation, families or doctors may panic and try and revive the person, Dr. Groff recognizes the blackout as the period of healing in itself and lets the person come back on their own. Another way that the body spontaneously releases traumatic energy while you're in psychosis is that it accelerates your heartbeat. And when that happens spontaneously for no other reason, you immediately start to breathe quicker. You start to hyperventilate. And that hyperventilation increases the oxygen, which releases trauma. The release of Kundalini energies can also be part of this process. I'm going to talk about my Kundalini experience in another video, but for now just know that they feel like very strong energies of heat or even cold that are moving through your body in a very powerful way. Along with the physical energy, we also need the release of the mental or creative energy that's within us. As we all know, people in mania have lots of ideas, and when a person's in a psychosis, the deep flow of psychosis, it's important to share these ideas and express them no matter how crazy they are, and the people supporting us need to be patient and listen instead of trying to shut us up. In order to give your supporters a break, maybe express yourself in your writing, doing writing or artistic expression. I find mandalas very good for allowing people to express themselves. Or even dancing or singing, basically anything creative that can help you express what you're going through as you heal. So is that it? Well, not quite, but I'm out of time. My 10 minutes are up, and you're probably exhausted by now. So while you take a break, I'll get started on part 2 in this series and how we heal our souls during psychosis. And there I'm going to talk about subjects like family secrets and perhaps most controversial of all, how we deal with the violence and aggression that's associated with bipolar disorder. So that's up next. According to psychiatry, one of the strongest signs that you've got bipolar disorder is when you start having delusions. And for them, any delusion is caused by a chemical imbalance, which will most likely need medication for your entire life. However, when you take a close look at the type of delusions that people have, many of them, which are very, very common among bipolar people, are often very spiritual in nature. Now, I've already introduced a few of these so-called delusions in the video Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment? So what I wanted to do in this video was just let you in on what I think are the roots of some of these delusions and why they're so common. And as you'll see, in my opinion, most of the so-called delusions are hardly the random connections of a broken brain, but come out of the complex relationship between your soul and your ego. Probably the most common delusion for people entering into psychosis for the very first time is to think that they are either dead or dying, and they should, because in a very real way, they are. You see, as I mentioned in the first video in this series, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, the cause of an acute psychosis will always be the collapse of your ego, or false self. But what I didn't talk about is simply what it feels like when this false self or ego collapse occurs. First, you feel totally different, completely unlike the self you have come to know your entire life. And a part of that self has been your false self, which is made up of all the thoughts and ideas that you have known yourself to be. That's the ego part of you. So then during the ego collapse, when all of this false self just seems to leave you on what I can best describe as an energetic level, you feel so unlike you've ever felt that it's easy to assume, as I did, that you're in fact dead or dying. And in a way, a part of you is. If your psychosis completes itself in a healthy way, much of your false self or ego will die, and what you'll be left with is a feeling that you are much lighter and less boxed in than you were before. After thinking that you're dead or dying, thinking that you're Jesus or some type of Messiah is probably the second most common delusion. Now, why would so many people think that? Well, don't forget that when the ego or false self collapses, what you're left with is your true self or soul. You see, when our ego is in control of things, we have this inner feeling that somehow we're not good enough, that somehow we need to better ourselves in order to justify our existence. And to do that, we need to be something that we're not. And this is the ambition of the ego, our false self, to build ourself up in almost like an artificial way. Then, when that ego drops, how do we feel? We feel perfect, limitless, sacred. So in a sense, we're actually trading one delusion, the delusion of the ego that actually we suck, for something that's quite the opposite. And so, engulfed in this feeling of perfection and sacredness, and without the rational egoic mind there to tell us otherwise, it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that we have become Jesus, our culture's strongest symbol of sacredness and perfection. And now it's true not everybody thinks of themselves as Jesus. People from other religious traditions or cultural backgrounds often identify with another religious figure. For example, people of the Islamic tradition might identify with Muhammad or see themselves as another prophet. But this idea of being the Messiah is by far the strongest image. And for women, if they don't see themselves as the Messiah or Jesus, they'll see themselves as actually giving birth to the Messiah, being the mother of Jesus or the Messiah. The third delusion is that we're somehow all-knowing. One sensation that most of us have in our everyday reality is that we never quite seem to know enough. Have you ever noticed that? It's as if no matter what we do, we just can't figure life out without more information. However, once again, when that ego collapses, we're left with this emotional intuition of the soul, which is telling us that everything is as it should be. And in that moment, there's the sensation of completeness. And with that completeness comes this sense of a perfect knowledge, a sense that you know everything there is to know, and yet somehow you can't explain it in words. It's as if you're having one giant nuclear aha moment. And so, considering that you feel that you're a sacred Messiah and have this perfect all-knowing information, what's to do? Save the world, of course. At this point, many people seem to become obsessed with certain social issues like homelessness, poverty, the greenhouse effect, this sort of thing. And then others, including Dr. David Lukoff, felt the compulsion to write their own religious text. The Jim Carrey movie The Truman Show is probably the most common reference that I've heard when asking people what psychosis is like. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise, because once the ego collapses, not only do our senses become more alive, but we also become more sensitive to other people, better able to read how they're feeling. And among the first things that you'll notice while you're in psychosis about the so-called normal people around you is that to some extent, pretty much everybody is acting, meaning that they're all hiding their true emotions, trying their best to fit into the role that they've sought out in society. And so seeing the world in this way, it's very easy to start to believe that you're in a movie, especially one like The Truman Show, where everybody is obviously fake and acting. And yet for many people at the same time, there's also the sensation that everything is just perfect, just the way it is. The psychiatrist, the hospital, many people in mania head for the psychiatric hospital willingly, thinking, I'll be perfectly fine. It's all part of God's plan, and everything is happening and unfolding as it's meant to happen. And in this way, the sense of being in a movie is not a whole lot different than what was written about life thousands of years ago in the ancient Hindu scripts of India, the Vedas, where it is written that life is a divine play. Number 6 is seeing people as angels or demons. Now, even though the experience can be very sacred, it can also be very confusing, and often we're not sure of what to do next, and we're very often looking for help. But when we start looking for help, we're not looking for the person in charge or the name tag of somebody. No, we're looking for people who are going to love us. And to figure that out, we're going to look a person straight in the eyes. And if their face is open and we see love in those eyes, then we will see an angel before us. However, if that person looks at us judgmentally, analyzing, trying to control and manipulating us, invalidating this sacred experience, then we see a demon and we want nothing to do with them. To me, the most remarkable delusion people have is the sense that they're being tested by God. And with everybody, the test is remarkably the same. Are you going to continue to live? In my last video, I talked about how when bipolar people are in a state of acute psychosis, they can have very spiritual experiences, sometimes even thinking that they're Jesus. However, experiences during acute psychosis can also be quite terrifying. But what's interesting is that even these terrifying experiences can have a spiritual dimension, because in some way people have the feeling that the devil is after them. Sometimes people see devils and feel like they're being chased by them. Other people feel like somehow that they're possessed and the devil is inside them. At certain points, some people actually feel like they are the devil in the same way that others have felt that they're Jesus. And then other people will have the devil or demons saying terrible things to them, like that they should kill somebody or kill themselves, that they're shit, that they're worthless, things like that. And so along with very loving experiences of good that we can have in psychosis, we can also have the dark side of the spirit world, experiences of evil. And more than any other, it's these dark and disturbing experiences that are the most difficult for people to work through. And they raise a very important point about the theory behind the videos I've presented up to now. You see, so far I've been saying that an acute psychosis starts when we have a collapse of the ego and you're left to experience your own soul. But if what you're experiencing is your own pure soul, where does the evil come from? Well, in truth, it certainly looks like our souls are not entirely pure. As I've mentioned in other videos, during our lifetimes we become traumatized by certain things, and if we don't experience all the feelings of our traumas, then they will stay with us as energies, in a sense contaminating our souls. And on another level, it certainly seems that some of us, if not all of us, have a certain amount of evil born into us when we come into this planet. Now, I know this idea is unpopular with some people, but certainly in Christianity there is the belief that we are born having original sin. That's why we need a baptism. And from Eastern spirituality, they believe that we come into this world from past lives, that we're reincarnated. And so if we look at ourselves that way, it could be possible that we come into this world from a past life carrying this karma or negative energies that are records of the sins we've committed in the past. And so based on what these religions have to say, in addition to what I actually see when people go into an acute psychosis, it certainly seems that we are born with a certain amount of lower or negative energies that we need to work through in this lifetime. And from what I've seen, there's no better place to work through these energies than in an acute psychosis. Because it's in this non-ordinary state of consciousness that these energies really come to the surface. And as I've mentioned in other videos, if you're able to embrace and engage these experiences, then the energies associated with them become released and you become a more purified human being. And this all sounds great except for one thing. When these energies are dark and disturbing and evil, it's very easy to go into a state of denial about what's happening to us. And once we're in denial about our own inner experience, then we start to project it. And once you start projecting, then you're in real trouble. Now, what is projection? Well, basically it's anything that's going on inside of you that you decide is actually happening outside of you, that's going on around you. And the most famous form of projection is paranoia. Paranoia comes in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have one thing in common. It always feels like someone or something is out to get you. People think that the CIA or the FBI is after them, or that maybe they're being monitored or even controlled by space aliens, or even the Illuminati, whoever that is. It could be your psychiatrist who's spying on you to make sure you take your medication, or even your friends and family that are conspiring against you. For one homeless guy in my neighborhood, his problem is snakes. He's totally concerned that snakes are going to crawl up his pant legs. Germs can also be a big problem because they're invisible and they exist everywhere. And in many situations, the paranoid person will have the feeling that the groups that are after them, although maybe not the snakes and the germs, will have some sort of surveillance equipment to keep an eye on them as well. Paranoid people can have the sensation that their phones are being tapped when they're really not, or that there's hidden cameras in their homes, or maybe even that someone's put a microchip in their brain in order to control them. Now, where does the paranoia come from? Well, I think Dr. Stan Grof has the best explanation that I've found so far, because he thinks that when the ego collapses, often we find ourselves in this cosmic oneness where there's no boundaries. And in that oneness we can feel connected to everything and it can feel quite good. But the dark side is that if there's no boundaries, then there's also no defenses. And whatever is out there can get in here and get to me and attack us. And I think a great example of this is when people start to have psychic sensations. Once in an acute psychosis, people become extremely sensitive and may even have the feeling that they're becoming psychic, reading other people's thoughts. And while some people might enjoy this newfound sensation, other people can have the reverse feeling that, uh-oh, if I can read other people's thoughts, then maybe they can read my thoughts. And that's the paranoid part of the whole thing. Now, as I've said in many videos, I think it's very possible to heal yourself from bipolar disorder and episodes of acute psychosis. However, if somebody is really locked into a series of paranoid thoughts, that healing process becomes extremely difficult. Because the paranoid person is projecting their inner experience and not dealing with it, that means that they're not healing. It's impossible for them to move through the process. Now, while there is the possibility that a very compassionate support team is able to turn the paranoid person around and get them to engage their process, there is also the darker possibility that the paranoid person blames the support team for what's happening to them and refuses their help entirely. In being uncooperative, they might try and escape or run away, and they may even try and attack the support team. And so it's for all of the reasons I just mentioned that someone in a deeply paranoid state will most likely need medication unless they can be turned around quite quickly. Now, this may be a shock to people who followed my work, but what you need to understand is that in a state of paranoia, there's no healing taking place and the person is suffering unnecessarily. And so while it is true that many paranoid people will need medication, I hope that we can use it in the future as a tool and not as a way of life. And what that means is that while the person is being medicated, they're also working to get in touch with the feelings that they were rejecting while they're in psychosis. Because what you normally find is when you meet somebody that's had a very traumatic psychosis, chances are they've also had a very traumatic life. So whether you feel that devils and demons are after you, or you're scared of the teddy bear in your bedroom, in the end, all of these experiences are rooted in the dark and fearful energies that are within ourselves. And while it may be very difficult sometimes, still, the more you're able to work through these energies, the better off you'll be. So what does bipolar disorder have to do with different levels of consciousness? Well, it turns out a lot. And to illustrate my point, the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about the different people we worked with who had bipolar disorder this year. So the first person I'll talk about is my younger niece, who I will call here Anna. It's really her story that got me involved in this subject in the first place. Now, for those of you who don't know me, 12 years ago I was sent to a psychiatric hospital with an experience that other people saw as insanity, but I was sure was very beneficial to me. I eventually discovered that what I had had was not a mental illness at all, but what was called a spiritual emergency. Dr. Stan Groff, Dr. David Lukoff, and others recommend that spiritual emergencies not be medicated or hospitalized because allowing them to process can be very beneficial to the person in crisis. Now, before my wife and I met Anna, she had already been in her experience for 3 days and was already being heavily medicated by psychiatry. So my big question at the time was Anna mentally ill, or was she having an experience like my own, something like a spiritual emergency? To start, our experiences had a lot more similarities than there were differences. We both went through periods of high energy levels, had a strong desire to take off our clothes. Our sense of taste, smell, vision, all of that heightened. We had strong feelings of euphoria during the experience, and we both became extremely emotional. As far as differences go, the biggest difference was in our background. I had had my crisis at the age of 30, and I had been university educated and well-traveled by then. And she had her crisis when she was only 17 years old and just leaving high school, going on to university. If there was one big difference, it was how we approached the experience. I saw mine as a deeply sacred thing, and I knew it was a special thing to go through. And while she had some spiritual aspects, on the whole, she was experiencing a lot of fear. She was afraid to go upstairs in her own house without her mother with her. That's how disturbed she was by the experience. And while I did take strong action to understand what happened to me, I avoided seeing psychologists or psychiatrists because I didn't think they understood what happened to me, and I didn't take any medication after my 3-day hospitalization. Anna, on the other hand, was quite quick to comply with what her parents and psychiatrist wanted her to do. She's been seeing a psychiatrist and psychologist and has been medicated indefinitely. Convinced that Anna was not mentally ill, I went to work studying the difference between a spiritual emergency, which is what I had had and been so beneficial, and this bipolar disorder, this thing called bipolar disorder that she was being labeled with. And thanks to the YouTube community, I discovered that many people who have been labeled with bipolar disorder had experiences in acute psychosis that were identical to my own spiritual emergency. Along with the symptoms Anna showed, there can be experiences of oneness and timelessness, a sense of all-knowing the universe, and even a sacredness to the experience. You can experience delusions and hallucinations, usually of a spiritual nature. You will also think that you're dreaming or in some sort of a play or a dream world, and in this dream world you will want to test reality, which could lead you to want to walk through walls or even smash your car. Other symptoms can include the sense that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, the prophet, or a saint. More and more, it looked like spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder were the same thing. And then, just as I was figuring all this stuff out, Anna's older sister, Eliana, had an experience of her own. And once again, the initial symptoms were identical to Anna's and my own. And Ileana strongly conveyed the experiences of the spiritual emergency as well, the oneness, timelessness, delusions, testing reality. Now, knowing what had happened to her sister, once her crisis got deeper, she called us immediately, and we supported her for 5 days completely unmedicated and without hospitalization. Now, to my surprise, Ileana had much deeper experiences than I did. She had very deep out-of-body experiences, which had her feeling no pain for 3 days, even though she was bumping into things. She felt that she was in her mother's womb and actually started to re-experience the birth happening all over again. In general, even though most of her experience with us was quite pleasant, once she came back, she was quite disturbed and frightened by the whole thing. While the bulk of her psychosis happened in the first manic episode, she would go on to have 2 more, and it was only after the third psychosis, which happened about 2 months later, that she was able to feel that she had a genuine rebirth and was finally able to get back to normal life. So the whole thing took about 2 months. Based on this limited experience, one thing became very clear, which is that Ileana never would have made it through her process without our aggressive interventions. And yet, for some reason, I had been able to get through this experience totally unsupported. How? My first clue came when I started talking to Anna, and I realized that she didn't recognize any sacredness to the experience that she had been going through, like I had 12 years earlier. And in talking to her about God, it became very clear that her God was quite a concrete Jesus figure. Jesus was God for her, and this is the person she prayed to for guidance. So like all people at the traditional level of consciousness, her approach to the divine was clearly a religious one. And in the religious mindset, God is clearly above you and separate from you, and for people to have an experience of God is a very rare thing that only tends to happen to prophets, saints, these sort of people. So for anyone of the traditional religious mindset, the first thought is that an actual experience of God is in fact impossible. It's a lot more likely that what's happening to you is the work of the devil. Now, in contrast to Anna, I had moved into the postmodern level of consciousness at about the age of 28. At that point in time, I awakened to the fact that while God could be outside of you, God could also be within you. And as a result, when I went into my psychosis 2 years later, the sacredness of it was unmistakable. So whereas I was able to trust this process and go with it, Anna was very unsure of what was happening and trusted the authority figures who told her to stop it immediately. And in her case, these authority figures were at the modern level. That's where our medical model is today. And similar to the traditional level, any psychosis, spiritual or otherwise, should be blocked immediately, not because it's the work of the devil, but because it's a malfunction of your biological machinery. And it was at this modern level that Eliana had been exploring reality. Much like a social scientist, she had been traveling France recently and found the culture there fascinating and found herself a little bit confused as to what was the truth, which was the proper way to live, the right way to live, the French way or the Brazilian way, which way was right. And unlike traditional people that always carry a cultural bias, Eliana was looking at things in a very objective, factual way. And with this rational approach to life, she really showed her modern level of consciousness. Now, while all this was happening, I was getting a lot of email coming in through YouTube, and by now I've probably talked to over 200 people who have had some sort of psychosis. And one thing was very surprising. Some people were making it through, as I had, unsupported. They were healing, and what was really interesting was that all of these people that were healing were fitting into the postmodern level of consciousness. Just like the postmodern profile, these people had a deeper interest in spirituality than normal, and when their experiences came, they often did come related to some sort of spiritual practice or insight that came related to their relationship with God. They were almost always university educated, and generally over the age of 25. Almost all of them were over the age of 25. And how did they do it? Well, they recognized it for the sacred experience that it was, and they surrendered to the process. Now, I want to remind you that this was a small group of people among the postmodern types that had this rebirth as I did and came through unmedicated. Everyone else was having their process blocked, either by the psychiatry and psychology of the modern level, by the religion of the traditional level, or even by their own fears. So, how do levels of consciousness affect bipolar disorder? Well, for one, it's only at the postmodern level of consciousness that we start to open up to the possibility of a positive spiritual manic experience. And as a result of this open attitude, some postmoderns are able to heal their disorder without support, simply by surrendering to the experience with faith. In contrast, people at the modern and traditional levels cannot heal without support because their level of consciousness is not prepared for this spiritual experience. And neither are the institutions of mainstream psychiatry, mainstream psychology, and organized religions, all of which harm what should be a sacred healing process. However, healing is possible for people at other levels, with loving support and a level 7 power of now approach to this psychosis. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. Starting in April of 2007, I went out on a mission to answer a simple question. What is the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder? And now, finally, after almost 3 years of research, thousands of emails and comments, and 20 consecutive slideshow videos on this subject alone, I can finally share with you my definitive answer. And that answer is that I've been asking the wrong question. However, as you'll see, by figuring out that I was asking the wrong question, I eventually stumbled upon the right one. And with that, I think I've come across an absolute breakthrough with regards to how, as a society, we view both bipolar disorder and spiritual experiences. A breakthrough that could eventually lead to the healing of thousands of people, not only from bipolar disorder, but from schizophrenia and many other mental disorders. So what this video is really about is how I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. You see, before I knew anything about bipolar disorder, I had searched for a clinical understanding of my own spiritual awakening shortly after it happened about 10 years ago. It was then that I discovered the work of Dr. Stan Grof, and for Grof, there was a condition that looked very much like mental illness, but could actually lead to a spiritual breakthrough, which is what I had, and he called this condition a spiritual emergency. In reading his book, The Stormy Search for the Self, I finally found some validation for my spiritual experience, something that few others were willing to believe, that what I had been through was indeed spiritual and not a mental illness. And in the back of this book, he had an appendix to help people determine the difference between a mental illness like schizophrenia and a true spiritual emergency. So here were some of the criteria for a spiritual emergency. First, exams show no pathology or disease affecting the brain. The intellect and memory are challenged but intact. Adequate pre-episode social functioning and healthy relationships. Enough trust to be able to communicate and cooperate with others during the episode. And conversely, there should be an absence of self-destructive behavior, aggressive behavior, or withdrawal from help. The person in a spiritual emergency could also have the feeling that something important, healing, and even spiritual is happening. Spiritual themes such as birth and death are also present in an experience of spiritual emergency. And so, because my experience met all of Grof's criteria, I went for over a decade thinking that my experience and that of people with mental illness were completely different. However, when my niece Anna had an experience in 2007, I was struck by how similar it was to my own and became convinced that she was having a spiritual emergency, even though her psychiatrist was medicating her for what he saw as a mental illness, most likely bipolar disorder. It was then that I started this research project as well as making YouTube videos to share my story. Once the comments started rolling in, I realized that thousands of people labeled with bipolar disorder had stories similar to my own and fit Grof's criteria for a spiritual emergency. And not only that, but once I started producing theory videos explaining what actually happens to someone when they're in a spiritual emergency, I realized that many of us were going through the same deeply spiritual themes while we were in this apparent insanity. Both a spiritual emergency and bipolar mania can have a feeling of cosmic oneness to it, a feeling of timelessness. You may feel you have all-knowing universal knowledge or a deep sense of sacredness. There can be spiritual visions or voices, or as psychiatrists call them, hallucinations. You may think that you're dreaming or in a movie, that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, a prophet, or a saint, or that you're dead, dying, or being reborn. And these are just a few of the very common spiritual experiences that many bipolar people identified with in my videos. However, some bipolar people did not identify with these experiences at all. Not only did these people hate my videos, but they also hated me for making them. "What is so spiritual about wanting to kill my cats?" one guy asked me. "You're going to have to answer to Jesus for this," said one woman. Apparently, for some people, bipolar mania had been almost an anti-spiritual experience. Some people suffered from very demonic hallucinations. Others endured severe paranoia or deep feelings of anger. For me, these people seemed to be encountering experiences that I'd always considered to be closer to schizophrenia. But perhaps what was most common was not these highly positive spiritual experiences or the deeply fearful, painful experience. No, what was most common was a mixed episode. Most people would experience both ends of the spectrum, the love and the fear, the joy and the pain, the good and the evil. It seemed to me that rather than being a separation between spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder, there was a spectrum of experiences from those dominated by love to those dominated by fear, with most people having a type of mixed episode which would lie somewhere in the middle, a mix of love and fear. And not only that, but this spectrum would go from spiritual emergencies to bipolar disorder all the way to schizophrenia, with no definitive break between the three. And so it's in this way that I became convinced that three experiences which I was sure were completely separate from each other were actually all part of the same spectrum of experience. And that's when I realized that my original question was going nowhere, because I was never going to find a clear, distinct line between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder. But it was in realizing that I needed to change direction that I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. And that question is, if experiences of spiritual emergency, bipolar mania, and schizophrenia are all part of the same spectrum, then what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis? And it's that question that I intend to answer in part 2 of this video, which you can click on right here.